How much can we know, or should we know, of an author's life? And how relevant is it? Especially when we're speaking of an author of fiction, and possibly even more so when we're speaking of an author of science fiction, which of course does not resemble reality, except of course that it does, metaphorically, and increasingly so as we head into futurity. I discovered John Wyndham at a young age, and he was my favourite author for many, many years, and he probably still is. He was the person who introduced me to SF. After an initial reading of Conan Doyle's The Last Word, The Day of the Triffids seemed a natural place to start, and I read all his books from the time I was around 9 or 10 until my sort of mid-teens. Some years ago, I made the acquaintance of Sheila Crocker, who was a niece of John Wyndham, and we sort of bumped into each other a few times over the years, and more recently we sort of reconnected, and Sheila has given me some materials to go through, which I guess you could call archive materials. And of course, as you probably know if you're a Wyndham fan, there has been a quasi-biography of Wyndham by Amy Binns, which is based on really just a series of letters that she managed to acquire. And these are very private letters between Wyndham and his wife, Grace. And of course, I personally didn't like the book, not because I felt it was badly done, but because I felt the letters were too personal and not essentially relevant to the man in relation to his work. And I didn't really feel that Binns really has a good take on SF. For example, she calls it sci-fi. And also, I don't think she really appreciated Wyndham in terms of his influence on British science fiction and SF per se, which I thought was important. Other people had tried to do biographies before, but had become stuck through lack of material because he was a very private man. So I've got a few little bits and pieces here, some insights which I'm going to share with you. And what I really want to do was interview Sheila on camera, but people don't always want to do that, and that's fair enough. You have to respect their privacy. But I asked her to sort of let me know what her memories were of Jack, as the family called him, and Grace, his wife. And of course, Jack, John Wyndham Parks Lucas Bain and Harris was his full name, was, as to say, a private man. Sheila shared some memories with me of her memories of Jack and Grace, and she said that she remembered staying with Grace at the Pen Club, Bedford Place, London, which was where the Wyndhams lived for many years. They didn't get married until very late. They didn't get married till the 60s. They had some quite progressive ideas. And she says that Jack had a sitting room that was full of fitted bookshelves and a futuristic round fan heater, which looked like something from outer space. And she was given tea, but it was Earl Grey and she didn't like it, and she poured it into a plant pot. Perhaps that's what prompted extra triffids. And her brother was treated to a Gilbert and Sullivan opera while she was taken to the ballet at Covent Garden. And also she had a cousin called Basil who lived at the Pen Club as well. He was a Quaker, and his bedroom had just a bed and a window wide open, and he was a campaigner for prison reform. So the Wyndhams are quite an unusual family. They seem like certainly a non-conformist family in a sort of very sort of quiet English way. And when Grace and her brother finished their stay, her brother bought some flowers from a street seller, and she said that Grace had finished being a teacher, but then she was a teacher before that, and she suffered from hay fever in summer. So they went abroad in the summer, and when they went abroad, they would send stamps to Sheila for a stamp collection. They didn't attend the wedding, but sent a generous gift, and they used that to buy a twin tub washing machine, which Sheila says was useful in 1968. She was about to start a family. Now, of course, Wyndham died in 1969, and he was quite young. And one story is that he died while cutting the grass at Steep, the house in which he lived in the countryside. But he didn't. He had a gardener to do that. And apparently Grace didn't cook clean. They had a housekeeper. So those were their luxuries from John's royalties. And the thing is, Wyndham smoked very heavily, she remembers. And Sheila still has some heirlooms, which I've shown in other videos. And she said that because Jack smoked so heavily, it took a long time for a coffee table particularly, which was bequeathed to her, which they bought at Harrods, smelled of smoke for quite a long time afterwards. So as you see, for family members, their personal subjective memories of their encounters with the famous are different to what we would expect. They are mundane, everyday things, the things that we know and learn and have experiences with our family when we're very young particularly. It's the sort of things that we encounter which are often very ordinary that remain. But Sheila shared some more things with me which I'm going to try and share with you now. And I'll show you some photographs and let's just go through. So this one here, Wyndham's not in that one. That's Grace there, seated in the centre, and that's in 1975. So that's some years after Wyndham had died, and these are photocopies, so they're not brilliant quality, but it just gives you an insight into the ordinary part of things. And that's Sheila just there, who's a young woman with children, and that's her father there as well. The very old-fashioned photograph in the centre of the frame is Grace as a schoolgirl, so that goes way, way back to the 1920s, really, I would imagine. And this picture here, the chap with the tie, is John Wyndham, and basically that's Sheila's father there as well. And her father died in 1978. And that picture there is the countryside beyond their garden. Typically English, and nothing spectacular, but very, very nice nonetheless. I have some other documents here. I have a copy of Grace's will, which says, I'm not going to cover it in depth because it's sort of private stuff, but it does say that Wyndham's copies of his books and things written about him were bequeathed to Bedale School, which was nearby, to the librarian there. So that's something quite interesting. But of course, there is a John Wyndham archive at Liverpool Science Fiction Foundation where the SF course is taught. And I've also got a letter here from Christopher Priest. I introduced Sheila to Christopher Priest back in 2016, and he wrote her and said, thanks for letting me see some items. She'd lent him some things, and he had just watched the BBC4 documentary about Wyndham, which he'd missed when it was on, and noted that there were several errors in the programme. And also he asked a couple of questions. And something here also that she's given me is these are photocopies. I don't have the originals. I've never looked for them because I've never been a magazine collector, of the issues of Collier's magazine in which Day of the Triffids first appeared in the States as Revolt of the Triffids, a VT, a variant title. And what you will see here, Collier's was a slick magazine. It wasn't a pulp SF magazine. It was a slick magazine, so it had a very broad general readership, and on slick paper. And of course, the first people to break through to the slicks from genre SF were Ray Bradbury, and also Jack Finney's The Body Snatchers, I think, was published in Collier's as well. And that was a little later on. That was about 55. And here's one of the illustrations, which shows the blinded city, of course, after the meteor debris, which is actually a satellite weapon gone wrong. And it's quite interesting because Priest points out in his letter that there are differences in the magazine to the book, and that he feels this is probably because the magazine editors had to change things, lengths, what have you, to make it fit within their pagination and what have you. But it's quite interesting to see these originals. And Sheila does collect sort of Wyndham Arniers, I guess, and she's lent me a couple of issues of Foundation. But in this particular issue, which is number 75, you can pick these up without too much difficulty. You probably get, Dorset Bob's probably got loads of them, for example. There's an article about John Wyndham by his brother Vivian, which is quite interesting. And in issue 74, the previous issue, there's an article about the Wyndham archive, which, as I say, ended up at Liverpool, the Science Fiction Foundation at Liverpool University. And they've sort of had all sorts of things there. They had a Return of the Triffids display there for a little while in January, February 1999, full of all sorts of things in glass cases. And it's quite interesting to look at that and to see what was there. I don't know if any of you managed to get to that. I wasn't aware it was on. And of course, that's 25, 26 years ago now. And I have some detailed notes about the John Wyndham archive, which tell me at great length what is in the archive. So I'm just going to skip through some of it out of interest for you, because of course since then some early works and unpublished works have surfaced and have been published, which is really, really good. So there's things like novels, there are dust jackets, there are manuscripts, all sorts of things. And they date from between 1935 and 1968. And there's, let's see, Foul Play Suspected, which was his crime novel, which basically, was only reissued by Modern Library about 2 years ago in paperback. It still hasn't been issued in the UK. And before that, you could pay up to 20 grand for a copy. It was super rare. It was published by Noons. And there's a load of page proofs, letters and invoices relating to that. And of course, it was published under the name John Bainan. There's also Planet Plane. There are galley proofs, dust wrappers, tear sheets, and there's a taster for the novel on the dust wrapper, which Planet Plane basically Planet Plane was actually published as Stowaway to Mars, wasn't it? Which is quite interesting. So let's see, is that right? Was it Stowaway to Mars? Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And then you've also got the reissue, let's see, yeah, of it was serialized in the Passing Show magazine and published as Planet Plane in 1936. Also, the story was also known as The Space Machine, which is something I didn't realize. And of course, The Space Machine later became the title of the novel by Christopher Priest, which conflates the time machine and War of the Worlds. And it's a steampunk novel in a way, but it's more importantly regarded as a work of recursive SF, a science fiction novel about science fiction. And it's very good, but it is an oddity in the Priest canon. So maybe that was where Chris got The Space Machine from, maybe not. There's also 7 items from the Day of the Triffids. There's the manuscript, a typescript, all sorts of stuff. There's a bound volume, there's the ribbon typescript. So there's all sorts of stuff there. So there's the original material. So if you're studying Wyndham, you can request a look at these. And also there's details from the American magazine publication of Revolt of the Triffids. There's the manuscript of the Kraken Wakes, and also his typescript as well. And of course in the USA that was called Out of the Deep. So I've mentioned VT's variant titles on the channel many times. And I always make the same comment that in most cases, the titles of British SF novels, which can often be quite literary, are often dumbed down for the American market, the American pulp market, to meet the expectations of sci-fi readers. And I've always thought that's a terrible disservice being done. And it even works the other way around. When Alfred Bester was in the UK writing what most people call The Star's My Destination, it was actually published as Tiger, which is a reference to William Blake, and it was first published with that title in the UK. And it's a much better title than The Star's My Destination, which is so obvious it's not true, even though it's a quotation from the book. Also, there's material relating to the chrysalids, such as the typescript. And the Midwich Cuckoos. There's bits and pieces, including the bound ribbon typescript, page proofs. And, so there is quite a lot in there. Something that's in that archive as well, which remains unissued, as far as I'm aware, I don't think it's been collected or published, is the holograph of Midwich, Maine, which is the original manuscript of an unfinished sequel to the Midwich Cuckoos. And basically, it was written because the makers of the film Village of the Damned, they wanted to do a sequel, and Wyndham was encouraged to write a novel which he could then sell, because of course had they just gone with the same characters, which they couldn't, because of course what happens at the end of Midwich, then they could have gone ahead with that, but he would have to write new characters in and go with that. But he abandoned it. And it's interesting that the sequel was a fairly uncommon thing in science fiction then, except in terms of most SF novels were magazine fix-ups. So actual novels, another classic example is Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle, in which of course Dick started a sequel. There's a couple of chapters being published, but there was no need for it. The works were complete in themselves. So that's some of the material that Sheila's been sending me. But what it's really done is it's really made me think about how difficult it is for biographers to do their work and how much dedication is required, really. This is something on the biology of the Triffids, which is quite interesting. And, you know, as I say, Binns, I wasn't that happy with her biography because I felt it delved into things. And at the same time, you can see how hard it is, especially if an author wanted to be private and didn't want to reveal a lot about themselves. And even though people in SF circles in the 30s, 40s, 50s knew Wyndham, other writers, they said, you know, that he was quite a private man, even though he was quite charming. So it is an interesting thing in itself. Does it really matter? Do we need to know? Well, perhaps Wyndham's assumed reticence is one of the reasons why his prose went down so well with British readers and how he became a best-selling author when he stopped trying to write in the American models. Maybe that's part of it. Maybe it's that quiet reserve and that common sense and that kind of decency that where people didn't overshare things. Perhaps that's quite a big part of it. But of course, Wyndham was dismissed to a degree by Audis as a cosy catastrophist. But as I've said before in other videos too, I think he was anything but. I think his key theme in the major books was, of course, social Darwinism and the survival of the fittest, and he looked at that unflinchingly and addressed it. And, you know, there's a lot of moments in Triffids, Kraken, and particularly in the Chrysalids and Midwich Cuckoos, which are far from comfortable. You know, people are up against it. It's more about the dialogue of the moral decisions they make that get to that, which I guess you could say is cozy. But in my view, it's anything but, because there's serious decisions. So that's a little look at some archive materials I've been looking at. Am I about to embark on a biography of John Wyndham? Definitely not, because I don't think one is necessary. I think in some cases, I mean, next year we're going to see the biography of J.G. Ballard by Christopher Priest, which Priest started to write, got a certain distance in, and then he died himself, ironically of prostate cancer, the same as Ballard, and has been finished off by Priest's partner and wife Nina Allen, who's a very fine writer, and that comes out next year. And of course the difference with that is that Ballard was a bit more of a public figure, especially in later years. He had a very interesting childhood in the prison camp in China and in the Japanese prison camp, and that is deemed to be the centre of where his imagery and his famous way of dealing with SF comes from, because he was influenced by Wyndham as well. So we'll see. Biographies of science fiction writers are few and far between. There's never been many of them, and I wish there were more. Somebody has on the channel said, you know, has made a comment several times, they think I should write one of Keith Roberts, but I didn't know Keith. I would have to sort of do a lot of research. I haven't got the time, and I don't think anybody would be interested in publishing it. Well, they would, but it would be such a small thing. And really I'd need to talk to those people before they're gone as well. But that time is behind us, and sometimes the writing itself is what matters the most. Musing on biographies. Have you read any biographies of SF writers? I mean, recently we've had the Harlan Ellison one, a while ago there's the Fred Pohl one. Let me know of any others you've come across. There's the James Tiptree one, because they are uncommon things. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Thanks to Sheila Crocker and to her husband Richard for supplying some materials and getting me thinking about how difficult the art of biography is. Bye for now.